Ethan Carter stood at the edge of his floor-to-ceiling window, the lights of Manhattan glittering like a promise he no longer believed in. Cars crawled like tiny insects across the bridges, the river reflecting the restless pulse of the city. Inside his penthouse, silence was his only companion. He was 34, the youngest tech billionaire on Forbes' list, owner of a company that had redefined digital payments in America. Every news headline praised him: visionary, genius, the man who can't lose. But behind closed doors, Ethan Carter was just a man too afraid to sleep because the dreams would come. He remembered the nights spent coding in a damp Brooklyn apartment, the ramen noodles, the promises he whispered to his mother's old photograph on the fridge. One day, Mom. One day. And one day came. But she wasn't there to see it. Now, everything he touched turned to gold except the hollow feeling in his chest. Every party felt like a staged show. Every woman he met seemed to see only dollar signs in his eyes. Friends became business partners. Business partners became competitors. And love became something he read about but could never hold. Ethan closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the cold glass. The city felt alive, but he felt like a ghost moving through it. His phone buzzed. Another notification. Another deal. Another zero added to his already heavy bank account. He swiped it away, wishing he could swipe away the emptiness just as easily. The clock struck midnight, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, he picked up his coat, grabbed the keys to his less conspicuous black Jeep, and left his towering building. He drove without a destination, letting the neon signs of corner stores and the glow of 24-hour diners blur past him. His car finally stopped near a small community center in Brooklyn, one he had quietly funded through a charity arm his PR team used for image management. But tonight, he wasn't there for a photo op. He wasn't there for image. He just wanted to remember why he had started in the first place. From across the street, he saw lights still on in the building. Inside, a young woman was stacking books on a shelf, her hair tied in a loose bun, wearing a cozy sweater that looked worn but loved. She was humming softly, completely unaware of the world outside. There was something about the way she moved and hurried, peaceful, that made Ethan's chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years. For a moment, standing under the streetlight, Ethan Carter didn't feel like a billionaire. He felt like a man on the outside looking in, wanting to find a place where he could belong. And as the woman turned, her eyes catching his through the glass, everything else fell away. The world, the money, the city. In that brief moment, it was just two souls seeing each other across a window, in a city that rarely let people see each other at all. Ethan didn't know it yet, but tonight was the night everything began to change. Leela Green carefully slid the last book onto the shelf, brushing a curl away from her cheek as she glanced around the small reading corner she had fought to keep alive in the community center. The room smelled of old pages and hope, two things she had grown to love. Outside, the Brooklyn air was crisp, the streets quieter at this hour, the only sounds coming from distant sirens and the low hum of streetlights buzzing against the dark sky. She tugged her sweater closer around her shoulders, worn at the elbows but warm, a gift from her grandmother when she graduated college. Leela glanced at her watch, the gold edges faded. Almost midnight. She should have been home, but it had been a long day of reading sessions with children whose eyes sparkled at every new word learned, and she stayed behind to reorganize the donations so they could find their favorite books. Easily tomorrow, humming softly, she moved another stack of children's picture books, her voice barely louder than the creaks of the wooden floor beneath her feet. It was a song her mother used to sing, one she barely remembered the words to, but the melody comforted her. As she lifted her gaze to the window, she froze. Across the street, under the glow of a flickering lamp, stood a man in a dark coat, watching the building. For a moment, a ripple of fear ran through her, but then she saw the way he stood, hands in pockets, shoulders curved forward, not threatening, but tired, almost lonely. The streetlight glinted off his dark hair, and in that moment, he lifted his eyes to meet hers through the glass. She couldn't see much of his face, but she could see the way he looked at the building, like it was a lighthouse in the middle of a dark sea. Their eyes held for a second, long enough for her to feel her heart beat once, twice, before she offered a small, uncertain smile. Not the kind she gave everyone else, but the quiet, real kind, the kind that said, "I see you," even if she didn't know why. She turned away quickly, embarrassed, pretending to straighten the books on the table as heat rose to her cheeks. When she peeked up again, The man was gone, the sidewalk empty under the buzzing light. Leela let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. She pressed her hand against her chest, steadying the odd flutter that lingered there. Outside, Ethan Carter sat back in his Jeep across the street, watching the glow from the window where she had stood, the ghost of her smile lingering in his mind longer than it should have. It was just a moment, just a glance, but it was the first time in a long time that he felt seen without a price tag hanging over his head. In that moment, he knew he would be back tomorrow, though he couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the way she moved, or the way she smiled, or maybe it was the quiet, unspoken promise in her eyes that made the world feel softer, even for a billionaire who thought he could never belong anywhere again. And across the street, as Leela turned off the lights and closed the door behind her, she whispered to herself in the dark, "Tomorrow will be a good day." The next morning, Ethan Carter woke up earlier than usual, the city still half asleep under the blush of dawn. He had meetings lined up, emails flooding his inbox, and a board presentation demanding his focus, but none of it felt as pressing as the memory of that small, quiet smile from the night before. He tried to push it away as he showered and dressed in a simple gray sweater and jeans instead of his usual tailored suit. He skipped his usual driver, choosing instead to take the black Jeep, blending into the morning traffic. Unnoticed as he neared the community center, a wave of uncertainty hit him. What was he doing here? He wasn't sure, but the thought of going back to his glass tower without seeing her again felt heavier than all the deals waiting on his desk. Across the street, the center was alive with soft chatter. Children were gathering in the front yard with paper crafts and worn backpacks, their laughter piercing the morning air like music. Through the glass, Ethan saw her again, tying back her hair as she greeted each child with a hug or a high five. Her face warm and bright, he found himself smiling, really smiling. As he watched her kneel to tie a little boy's shoelaces while the boy chattered about the dragon he drew the night before, gathering courage he hadn't needed in boardrooms or negotiations, Ethan crossed the street, pulling open the sender's squeaky glass door. The scent of old books, crayons, and the faint smell of coffee wrapped around him like a warm blanket. Inside, Leela glanced up, surprised to see a stranger in the doorway, but her eyes softened with recognition. She tucked a stray curl behind her ear, trying to hide the small smile that threatened to break across her lips. "Hi," Ethan said, feeling strangely nervous. "Hi," she replied, brushing her hands on her jeans, a smudge of green paint on her wrist from an earlier art session. "I was driving by," he began, realizing how ridiculous that sounded. I saw you last night." Through the window, she tilted her head, studying him, her eyes searching his face for something he couldn't name. Then, to his relief, she laughed softly, a sound like wind chimes on a breezy day. "You're the man from under the streetlight." "I suppose I am," he admitted, scratching the back of his neck, feeling like a teenager. "What brings you here?" she asked, folding her arms, not unkindly but cautiously. Ethan looked around at the colorful drawings taped to the walls, the shelves of worn books, the laughter of children echoing from the hallway. He took a breath. "I'd like to help." Leela blinked, surprised. "Help?" "Yes, with whatever you need here." She looked him over, taking in his expensive watch, even though he tried to hide it under his sleeve, and the restless energy in his eyes that spoke of a life far removed from this small community center. "You want to volunteer?" she asked, arching an eyebrow, a playful smile pulling at her lips. "If you let me," he replied. There was a pause, filled with the distant laughter of children, the sound of footsteps and the rustling of papers. Finally, she nodded. "All right, Ethan from under the streetlight. Let's see what you've got." She handed him a stack of children's books that needed sorting and pointed toward the small reading corner. As he took the stack, their fingers brushed, sending a small, warm shock through him that he tried to hide behind a quick cough. Leela turned away to greet a child who ran in with a drawing clutched in her hands, but for a moment, she glanced back at Ethan, their eyes meeting across the colorful room. He smiled, and this time, she didn't look away. As he sat cross-legged on the floor, sorting through worn pages of The Very Hungry Caterpillar and Where the Wild Things Are, Ethan Carter felt, for the first time in years, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Ethan Carter found himself sitting cross-legged on the colorful rug in the reading corner, children's books stacked around him like a tiny fortress. The scent of crayons and old pages filled the air, grounding him in a place that felt worlds Away from his high-rise office with glass walls and chrome, he glanced up occasionally, catching glimpses of Leela moving around the room with ease. She knelt to tie a child's shoelaces, high-fived a little girl who showed her a drawing, and gently mediated a disagreement between two boys arguing over a red crayon. Each smile she gave was genuine, each word patient. Ethan found himself pausing, watching her as she knelt beside a child, encouraging him to sound out words in a picture book. She was radiant in the simplest way, the kind of beauty that came from kindness, not the expensive gowns and forced laughter he saw at charity galas. Are you done sorting? Leela's voice pulled him from his thoughts. He looked down at the stack of books he had barely touched and let out a sheepish laugh. I guess I got distracted. She arched an eyebrow but smiled. It's okay, you're here, that's what matters. She sat down across from him, crossing her legs, her jeans dusted with bits of chalk and a smudge of yellow paint on her forearm. She picked up a book from the pile, flipping through the pages, her fingers brushing over a torn corner. These books, she said softly, they're the only escape some of these kids have. They take them home like treasures. Ethan nodded, realizing how much he took for granted. When he was a child, the library had been his sanctuary, the place where he could dream beyond the noisy apartment and the sound of his mother coughing in the next room. He picked up a copy of Where the Wild Things Are, holding it carefully. This was my favorite, he admitted. Leela's eyes lit up. Mine too. I used to imagine a world where monsters could be tamed, where I could sail away from everything scary. They shared a quiet laugh, and for a moment, the world around them faded. Then a little girl ran over, clutching a drawing of a purple dragon with wings too big for its body. Miss Leela, look what I made. It's beautiful, Ella, Leela said, pulling the girl into a quick hug. Do you want to show Mr. Ethan? Ella turned shyly to him, holding up the drawing. Do you like it? Ethan smiled, nodding. It's amazing. I've never seen a dragon with wings like that. Ella beamed before skipping away, leaving her drawing on Ethan's knee. She's one of the quiet ones, Leela explained, watching Ella rejoin the others. But she's got the biggest imagination. Ethan looked at the drawing again, his chest tightening in a way he couldn't explain. She's lucky to have you. Leela looked at him, her expression softening. They're the lucky ones. But so am I. They fell into a rhythm, sorting books, helping children with drawings, and handing out snacks from a small cupboard near the kitchenette. Leela teased Ethan when he struggled to open a stubborn juice box, and he laughed in a way that surprised him freely, without the weight of expectations. As the afternoon light streamed through the windows, painting golden stripes on the worn carpet, Ethan forgot about meetings, deadlines, and the constant ringing of his phone, which he had silenced and tucked away. At one point, Leela caught him watching the children, a soft, thoughtful look on his face. You're good with them, she said quietly. I forgot how much I missed this, he admitted, gesturing around. Leela tilted her head, studying him, sensing there was more behind his words, but not pressing. Instead, she smiled, a small, understanding curve of her lips that made Ethan's heart beat just a little faster. Thank you for helping today, she said, as the children were picked up by parents, and the room quieted. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, looking at him with warm, tired eyes. Thank you for letting me, Ethan replied. For a moment, they stood there, surrounded by the soft chaos of coloring pages and empty juice boxes, the hum of the heater, the only sound between them. Then Leela reached down, picking up Ella's dragon drawing from the floor. She folded it carefully, pressing it into Ethan's hand. A souvenir, she said, her eyes meeting his. Ethan looked down at the drawing, then back at her, unable to keep the small smile from breaking across his face. Thank you. And as he walked out into the fading light of the Brooklyn evening, the paper dragon tucked safely in his pocket, Ethan Carter realized that for the first time in years, he was already looking forward to tomorrow. Ethan Carter couldn't remember the last time he had driven without checking his phone at every red light. But that evening, as he left the community center, the Brooklyn air crisp and cool around him, his phone lay silent in his pocket, the paper dragon tucked beside it. The streetlights flickered on as he drove, the city transitioning from the hum of afternoon to the glow of evening. His mind replayed the soft laughter of children, the warmth of small hands tugging at his sleeves, and Leela's gentle smile when she handed him the drawing. He found himself turning back toward the community center, the urge to see her again pulling him like a tide. Inside, Leela was stacking chairs and wiping down tables, humming softly to herself. Her sweater sleeves were pushed up, revealing paint stains and ink smudges on her arms, but she didn't seem to care. She moved with a tired grace, each small task completed with care. Ethan knocked softly on the glass door. Leela looked up, surprise flashing across her face before her lips curved into a tired but genuine smile. Back again? She teased, opening the door to let him in. I forgot to return this, Ethan said, holding up the paper dragon, the corner of his mouth lifting. Leela laughed, the sound warm in the quiet room. Ella would be glad you took it. They stood there for a moment, the quiet stretching between them comfortably. Need a ride? Home? Ethan offered, his voice softer than it usually was. Leela hesitated, then nodded, pulling her cardigan tighter around herself. Sure, thank you. As they stepped outside, Leela locked the door, slipping the keys into her pocket. The street was quiet, the glow of the diner sign across the road casting a soft red light on the sidewalk. They drove in silence for a while, the radio playing low, the city lights blinking past. Leela pointed out the bakery where she bought bread when she could afford the fresh kind, and the tiny corner store where the owner saved the last bunch of bananas for her grandmother every Thursday. When they arrived at her building, a small brownstone, with peeling paint but warm lights in the windows, Leela turned to him, her hand resting on the door handle. Would you like to come in for a minute? She asked, uncertainty and hope flickering in her eyes. Ethan hesitated, the image of his penthouse flashing in his mind, empty and cold, before he nodded. I'd like that. Inside, the apartment smelled of chamomile and a faint hint of cinnamon. It was small, with mismatched furniture and faded rugs, but it felt alive. Photographs lined the walls, pictures of Leela as a child with missing teeth, a young woman with bright eyes who must have been her mother, and a smiling elderly woman holding a cat that glared at the camera. Leela, that you? A voice called from a nearby room. Yes, Nana. I'm home, Leela called back, helping Ethan hang his coat on the small rack near the door. A moment later, an elderly woman with warm brown eyes and silver hair shuffled in, leaning on a cane. Her eyes brightened when she saw Ethan, and she gave him a curious, knowing smile. And who is this young man? Nana asked, her voice filled with gentle amusement. This is Ethan, Leela said, brushing a hand over Nana's shoulder affectionately. He's helping out at the center. Nana's eyes twinkled. Ah, helping out. Well, you're welcome here, Ethan. Thank you, ma'am, Ethan replied, smiling, feeling oddly nervous under her warm, knowing gaze. Call me Nana, she insisted, waving a hand as she shuffled back toward the kitchen. Leela, I made some tea before you came. Why don't you pour some for your friend? They settled on the small couch, mugs of steaming chamomile tea warming their hands. The TV played softly in the background, an old sitcom that Nana seemed to enjoy, laughing at the same jokes she had likely heard 100 times. Ethan looked around, taking in the cozy clutter of books stacked in corners, the crocheted blankets draped over the couch, the small plants and coffee mugs lining the windowsills. This place feels like home, Ethan said quietly. Leela glanced at him, her eyes softening. It is home. They sat in comfortable silence, the soft ticking of the clock the only sound between them as they sipped their tea. Nana occasionally called out comments about the show, and Leela would laugh, shaking her head with affection. Ethan felt something shift inside him, a warmth spreading through the spaces that had been empty for so long. This wasn't the world he was used to, but it was a world he found himself craving. As the night grew later, Ethan stood to leave, Nana giving him a gentle pat on the arm. Come back again, Ethan, she said with a wink. I will, he promised. As Leela walked him to the door, she hesitated, her hand on the doorknob. Thank you for the ride, she said softly. Thank you for letting me in, he replied. Their eyes met, the air charged with something unspoken, something fragile and new. Then, in a quiet, instinctive moment, Ethan leaned forward, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead before pulling back. Leela's eyes widened, a faint blush rising in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. Good night, Leela. Good night, Ethan. As he stepped out into the Brooklyn night, the stars barely visible above the city lights, Ethan Carter felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Ethan Carter couldn't sleep. He lay in his penthouse bedroom, the city's lights casting restless shadows across the walls, the hum of traffic below a reminder of the world that never stopped. He had spent years chasing these lights, thinking they were the proof of everything he had achieved. But tonight, They felt hollow, like echoes bouncing around an empty room. All he could see when he closed his eyes was the soft glow of Leela's small apartment, the way the tea steamed in mismatched mugs, the way Nana chuckled at sitcoms, the warmth in the air as Leela tucked a curl behind her ear, smiling at him shyly, and the way it felt to press his lips gently to her forehead. The way she looked up at him with surprise and something softer, something that made his chest ache. He turned over, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the silence pressing against him. On the other side of the city, Leela lay awake in her small room, the glow of the streetlight outside filtering through the thin curtains. Nana was asleep, the quiet sounds of her breathing a comfort in the dark. Leela touched her forehead where Ethan's lips had brushed her, closing her eyes as warmth spread through her. She wasn't sure what she was doing, letting herself feel this way about a man who clearly came from a world so far removed from her own. But when she thought of him reading to the children, or struggling to open juice boxes while trying to hide his embarrassment, she couldn't help but smile. She turned over, hugging her pillow, letting herself drift towards sleep with Ethan's quiet laughter echoing in her mind. The next morning, Ethan found himself standing outside the community center before it even opened, coffee cups in hand, feeling more nervous than he had before any board presentation. When Leela arrived, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, a scarf wrapped around her neck to fight the chill. She paused at the sight of him. "You're early," she said, a smile tugging at her lips despite her attempt to sound casual. "I brought coffee," he said, holding out the cup. She took it, their fingers brushing, sending that familiar spark racing through both of them. "Thank you." They stood there for a moment, the quiet of the early morning wrapping around them like a blanket as they sipped their coffee. The city was just waking up, the sounds of delivery trucks and distant horns beginning to rise. "How's Nana?" Ethan asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "She's good. She really liked you," Leela replied, glancing at him with a soft smile. "I liked her too," Ethan said. "She reminds me of my mom." Leela's eyes softened, sensing the pain behind his words. "You miss her?" "Every day," Ethan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "She didn't get to see any of this." Leela reached out, placing her hand gently over his, the warmth of her touch grounding him. "She'd be proud of you, Ethan." He looked at her, the sincerity in her eyes cutting through the walls he had built around himself for so long. He swallowed hard, nodding. "Thank you," he whispered. The day passed in a blur of laughter and small chaos. Ethan read stories to the children, doing voices that made them giggle, while Leela helped them with crafts, her hands guiding theirs as they cut and glued colorful shapes onto paper. At one point, Ella, the shy little girl who had drawn the dragon, tugged at Ethan's sleeve, holding up a new drawing, a picture of him and Leela, standing under a bright yellow sun, surrounded by hearts. Ethan looked at it, his throat tightening as he smiled. "Is this us?" he asked. Ella nodded, grinning. "You look happy." Leela looked over his shoulder, her cheeks turning pink as she saw the drawing. She met Ethan's eyes, and for a moment, the noise of the room faded, leaving only the two of them standing there, connected by a child's simple, honest drawing. "Thank you, Ella," Leela said, her voice soft, taking the drawing and tucking it safely into a folder with the others. Later, as they were cleaning up, Leela found herself standing close to Ethan, their hands brushing as they reached for the same stack of books. "Thank you for being here," she said quietly. "I should be thanking you," Ethan replied, looking down at her, his dark eyes searching hers. "For what?" "For reminding me what it feels like to feel alive," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They stood there, the space between them charged, the unspoken words hanging in the air like a fragile promise. Then the sound of a child's laughter broke the moment, and they both stepped back, smiling awkwardly. As the children were picked up by their parents, Leela and Ethan stood at the doorway, waving goodbye until the room was quiet again. "Walk you home?" Ethan offered. Leela hesitated, then nodded, pulling her scarf tighter around her neck as they stepped out into the chilly evening air. They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing on the pavement. The city felt softer somehow, the lights warmer, the world smaller. As they reached her building, Leela turned to him, her breath visible in the cold air. "Thank you for today," she said. Ethan looked at her, his eyes gentle. "Thank you for letting me be a part of it." For a moment, they stood there, the world holding its breath. Then, with a courage she didn't know she had, Leela reached up, pressing a soft kiss to his cheek before stepping back quickly. Her cheeks flushed. "Good night, Ethan," she whispered. "Good night, Leela," he replied, his hand touching the spot where her lips had been. A small smile breaking across his face. As she disappeared into her building, Ethan turned and walked back down the street, the lights of the city brighter than they had ever seemed before. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Carter felt something real, something he wasn't willing to let slip away. The next morning, Ethan Carter sat at the head of a polished oak conference table, glass windows showcasing the Manhattan skyline behind him. His team presented quarterly reports, growth charts, and partnership updates, voices droning in and out as Ethan stared at the numbers. They were good numbers. Impressive even. Numbers that would make headlines. But all he could think about was Leela's soft kiss on his cheek, the warmth of her small apartment, the way the children laughed when he did silly voices while reading. He rubbed a hand across his jaw, the ghost of her touch still lingering there. "Ethan?" his COO, Derek, prompted, jolting him from his thoughts. "You good with this acquisition timeline?" Ethan blinked, refocusing. "Yeah, fine," he muttered, though he couldn't remember what they were talking about. Derek gave him a curious look but moved on. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind drifting again to Ella's drawing of him and Leela under a bright yellow sun. After the meeting, Ethan stepped into his office, shutting the door behind him. The silence was immediate, heavy and cold. The glass walls, the sleek furniture, the minimalistic decor, everything he once admired now felt suffocating. He pulled the drawing from his pocket, smoothing the crumpled edges, tracing the crooked lines of the hearts Ella had drawn around him and Leela. There was a knock at the door, and Derek stepped in, closing it behind him. "Look, man, I don't know what's going on with you, but you've been off lately," Derek said, crossing his arms. "This deal needs your full attention." Ethan looked up, the weight of the world pressing on his shoulders. "I know. Is this about that community center?" Derek asked, arching a brow. Ethan hesitated. "Yeah, partly." Derek let out a sigh, rubbing his temples. "Ethan, I get it. You want to give back. That's great. But we've got billions on the line here." "Don't lose focus." Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "Maybe that's the problem, Derek. Maybe it's not just about billions anymore." Derek stared at him, speechless, before shaking his head and leaving the office. Ethan sank into his chair, the drawing still in his hand, feeling the first crack in the armor he had built around himself for so long. That evening, Ethan found himself driving back to Brooklyn, the city lights blurring as he replayed Derek's words in his head. The community center. Leela was sweeping confetti from an earlier craft activity, humming softly to herself. She looked up, surprised but pleased to see him. "You're back," she said, leaning the broom against the wall. "I needed to be here," he admitted. Stepping closer, she studied him, noticing the tension in his shoulders, the exhaustion in his eyes. "Rough day?" Ethan let out a dry laugh. "You could say that." Without thinking, Leela reached out, brushing her fingers lightly across his hand. "You don't have to talk about it." But he wanted to. So he did. He told her about the meeting, about Derek's words, about how empty it all felt lately, how he felt like he was living a life that no longer fit him, a life he had fought for, but one that left him feeling like a stranger in his own skin. Leela listened, her eyes never leaving his, her presence steady and calm, grounding him in a way nothing else could. When he finished, he let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Leela squeezed his hand gently. "You're allowed to want something different, Ethan." He looked at her, the weight of the day easing in her warmth. "I don't know what that looks like." She smiled softly. "That's the beauty of it. You get to figure it out." Later, as they cleaned up together, Ethan found himself laughing. As Leela tried to catch a piece of paper a child's drawing had been taped to that kept fluttering down from the wall. It was simple, silly, and yet it felt like the most real moment he had lived in years. When they finished, Leela walked him to the door, the cool night air greeting them as they stepped outside. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly. "For what?" she asked, tucking a curl behind her ear. "For listening. For being here." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the glow of the streetlights. "Anytime, Ethan." There was a pause, the world soft around them, before Ethan took a small step forward, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek, letting his fingers linger for just a moment. Leela's breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest as she looked up at him, and then, Gently, carefully, Ethan leaned down, pressing his lips to hers in a soft, lingering kiss that tasted of hope and the promise of something real. When they pulled back, their foreheads rested together, both of them smiling, breathless. "Good night, Leela," Ethan whispered. "Good night, Ethan," she replied, her fingers brushing across his as she stepped back. As he walked away, Ethan glanced back to see Leela standing in the doorway, her hand pressed to her lips, a soft, radiant smile on her face. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Carter realized that maybe the life he had built wasn't the life he wanted. But, standing there with Leela, he felt like he was finally on the path to finding it. The next morning, Leela woke up with a smile she couldn't hide, even as she moved through her small apartment, feeding Nana her morning oatmeal and checking the medicine cabinet to ensure her prescriptions were in order. Nana noticed, of course. "Something's different today," Nana said, peering at Leela over the rim of her glasses. Leela paused, spoon in midair. "What do you mean?" "That glow, honey," Nana chuckled, tapping her chest with a crooked finger. "That's the look of a woman who's kissed a man she likes." Leela nearly dropped the spoon, her cheeks flushing pink as she laughed. "Nana?" But she couldn't deny it. Her mind kept drifting back to the moment under the streetlights, the softness of Ethan's lips, the way he held her like she was the only person in the world. Meanwhile, in Manhattan, Ethan stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie for a meeting he didn't want to attend. His reflection looked the same: sharp suit, polished shoes, perfect hair, but he felt different, lighter. The kiss lingered in his mind, grounding him in something real amidst the sterile white lights of the office halls. But the moment he stepped into the conference room, reality came crashing back. Derek was waiting, along with a few board members, laptops open, documents stacked high. "Ethan, we need to talk," Derek began, closing the door behind him. Ethan raised an eyebrow, shrugging off his coat and draping it over a chair. "About the press is sniffing around," Derek said, sliding a tablet toward him. Ethan glanced down. Headlines were popping up on tech blogs and finance sites. "Billionaire Ethan Carter seen in Brooklyn Community Center. Has Carter found a new PR stunt? Mystery woman spotted with Carter. Who is she?" Ethan's jaw tightened as he read, his fingers curling around the tablet. Pictures had been snapped from a distance, him handing out snacks to children, laughing with them. Leela beside him, her face bright and clear. "Who leaked this?" Ethan demanded, anger simmering in his chest. Derek raised his hands. "I don't know. But it's out there. Look, man. You know how these things go. We can spin this. Say it's part of a new charity initiative. Maybe get some good PR out of it." Ethan slammed the tablet down. "This isn't a stunt. I know, but the board— I don't care about the board." Ethan snapped, standing up, his voice echoing in the room. Silence fell, heavy and tense. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, breathing heavily. "This isn't a stunt," he repeated, softer this time. Derek sighed, rubbing his temples. "I get it, Ethan, but you need to be careful. People will dig into her, into that community center, into everything." Ethan's chest tightened. The last thing he wanted was for Leela to be dragged into the mess of his public life, for reporters to hound her, to tear apart the simple, warm world she had built for herself. He looked out the window, the city sprawling beneath him, feeling further away from it all than ever. That afternoon, Ethan drove to the community center, his mind swirling with thoughts of headlines, reporters, and the soft look in Leela's eyes when she kissed him. When he arrived, the center was cool. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she looked at him, searching his eyes for truth. "Then prove it," she whispered, and she turned away, wiping her tears, leaving Ethan standing there in the quiet room, the echoes of her words hanging in the air. That night, Leela sat by the window in her small apartment, looking out at the street lights, her heart heavy. Nana came over, sitting beside her, taking her hand in her wrinkled one. "Do you care about him?" Nana asked softly. Leela wiped a tear, nodding. "I do." "Then let him prove it, honey," Nana said, squeezing her hand. "And let yourself be loved." Outside, the city continued to buzz, unaware of the quiet battles fought in small apartments and lonely penthouses. And somewhere in the dark, Ethan Carter was already planning how to protect the woman he was falling for and the world she loved. Ethan barely slept that night. He paced the length of his penthouse, the city lights flickering beyond the glass, like a taunt, reminding him of the chaos he had unintentionally brought into Leela's life. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her tear-streaked face, the hurt in her eyes, the tremble in her voice when she asked, "Why are you really here, Ethan?" And her final words, "Then prove it." He didn't know how, but he knew he would. The next morning, Leela kept checking her phone, her heart leaping every time it buzzed, fearing it was a reporter, or worse, that it was Ethan, but it was only messages from parents checking in, Nana asking if she needed groceries, or a reminder about a meeting for the center's next event. She tried to focus, helping the kids with crafts, reading stories, laughing at their silly jokes. But her smile felt fragile, a thin shell hiding the storm within. Every time the door opened, she flinched, half expecting a stranger with a camera, half expecting Ethan, hoping and dreading at the same time. Ethan spent the morning on calls with his legal team, publicist, and Derek, who was still trying to convince him to spin the narrative for good PR. "I'm not using her for PR," Ethan snapped into the phone. Derek sighed, rubbing his temples on the video call. "Then what are you doing, Ethan?" "I'm protecting her." "From what? You? The world you live in?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Both." After the call, Ethan stared out at the city, realizing how much of his life was a fortress built to protect his success while isolating him from everything human. He didn't want that for Leela. He didn't want that for himself anymore either. That afternoon, Ethan drove to the community center, ignoring the advice of everyone around him to lay low. As he parked, he noticed a black car idling across the street, a long lens camera poking out the window. Anger flared in his chest, but he forced himself to calm before walking toward the center. Inside, Leela was wiping down tables, her hair pulled back, exhaustion in her posture. She looked up, and for a moment, they just stared at each other. Then she turned away, continuing to stack chairs, pretending to be busy. "Leela," Ethan said softly. "I'm working," she replied, her voice tight. "I know. I'll help," he said, picking up a stack of books to reshelve. They worked in silence for a few moments, the sounds of chairs scraping and books thudding the only noise. Finally Ethan spoke. "They're outside," he said quietly. Leela froze, her back stiffening. "I don't want this, Ethan." "I know." "Then why are you here?" she asked, turning to face him, pain in her eyes. "Because I'm not letting them take this from you," he said, stepping closer, lowering his voice. "Or from me." Her lips trembled, but she shook her head. "This is my life, Ethan. These kids, this center, my Nana, it's all I have. I can't let your world ruin it." "It won't," he promised, his eyes steady, voice low and certain. "How can you say that?" she whispered, tears brimming. "Because I'm going to make sure it doesn't," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a folded piece of paper. She looked at it, confused, as he handed it to her. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning. The document, deed of donation, Carter Foundation pledge to Brooklyn Community Center. Ethan swallowed. "I transferred the building under the sender's name. They can't take it away, even if my name is dragged into anything. I set up a trust to pay for repairs, programs, staff without any press releases, without any photos, without anyone needing to know it came from me." Leela looked up, tears spilling over as she read the signature at the bottom. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why would you do this?" "Because you asked me to prove it," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "And because I need you to know that this was never a game for me. That you, this place, these kids, you're real, Leela. And I don't want to lose that." Leela dropped the paper, covering her face as she sobbed, overwhelmed, her shoulders shaking. Ethan hesitated, then stepped forward, gently pulling her into his arms. At first, she stiffened, but then she melted into him, her tears soaking his shirt as she clung to him, her body trembling. He held her close, resting his chin on her head, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, feeling the way her small frame fit perfectly against him. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for everything I've brought to your doorstep." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, her eyes red but clear, searching his face. "You're an idiot," she whispered, a small, watery laugh breaking through her tears. "I know," he said, smiling softly. "And I care about you too," she added, her hand resting on his chest. He leaned down, brushing his lips against hers in a soft, tender kiss, tasting the salt of her tears, feeling the warmth of her forgiveness. When they pulled back, she rested her forehead against his, both of them breathing heavily. "Now what?" she asked softly. Ethan smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Now we face it together." Outside, the reporters waited, cameras ready, headlines half written. Inside, Ethan and Leela stood in the quiet warmth of the community center, holding each other, hearts pounding, ready to fight for the small world they had built together. And no matter what came next, the next morning, the world outside was anything but quiet. Photographers stood across from the community center, their cameras flashing whenever the door creaked open. A black SUV idled nearby, a reporter leaning against it with a coffee cup, eyes scanning for Ethan or Leela. Inside, however, there was a calm in the air, a warmth despite the storm brewing outside. Leela adjusted the colorful art projects the children had taped to the windows, determined not to let the chaos outside seep into the safe space they had created. She felt Ethan's presence before she saw him, turning to find him at the doorway, a soft, tired smile on his lips. "You came back," she said, unable to hide the relief in her voice. "I told you I would," he replied, stepping closer. Leela glanced at the door, where a camera flashed through the glass. "They're waiting." "Let them wait," Ethan said, his eyes on her, steady and warm. "We're not hiding." She swallowed, her fingers twisting together. "I'm scared, Ethan." He reached out, taking her hands in his, squeezing gently. "I know, but we'll get through this together." They spent the morning with the children, ignoring the occasional camera flash through the windows. Ethan read stories, his deep voice bringing the characters to life, while Leela helped the children draw pictures, the small room echoing with laughter. At one point, Ethan glanced at Leela, who was helping Ella tie her shoelaces, her head bent, a smile on her lips. He felt his chest tighten with something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of peace, of belonging. It wasn't the towering offices or boardrooms that made him feel alive. It was this. At lunchtime, Leela stepped outside with Ethan, holding his hand as they faced the reporters gathered near the sidewalk. Cameras clicked, voices called out, "Ethan, is this your new PR strategy? Who is she? Are you funding the center for a tax break?" Leela stiffened, but Ethan's hand squeezed hers, grounding her. He raised his other hand, signaling for silence, his eyes scanning the crowd, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here for a photo op. I'm not here for a tax break. I'm here because I care about this place and the people in it." "And who is she to you?" a reporter shouted, pointing to Leela. Ethan glanced at Leela, meeting her gaze, his eyes softening as he spoke. "She's the reason I remember what matters." A hush fell over the reporters, their cameras lowering as they processed his words. Ethan turned back to Leela, ignoring the cameras, focusing only on her. "If you want me to leave, I will. But if you let me stay, we'll face this together." Tears welled in Leela's eyes, but she shook her head, gripping his hand tighter. "I don't want you to leave," he smiled, brushing a thumb across her cheek, ignoring the flashes of cameras capturing their moment. Later, inside, Ethan and Leela sat together on the small couch in the office, the children playing in the other room, their laughter a soft background melody. "I meant what I said out there," Ethan told her, turning to face her fully. "You're the reason I remember what matters." Leela blinked, tears slipping down her cheeks as she smiled, her hand resting on his cheek. "You're a good man, Ethan Carter. No matter what the world says." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, letting her words wash over him. For so long, he had lived for numbers, deals, and accolades that felt empty the moment the applause faded. But with Leela, there was no performance, no mask, just the raw, imperfect truth of who he was and who he wanted to become. He opened his eyes, looking at her with a tenderness that took her breath away. "Stay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised us. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, painting them in soft gold, Leela leaned forward, pressing her lips to his in a gentle, lingering kiss that spoke of trust, of hope, of something growing quietly and steadily between them. And, for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt alone in the world. Together, they were ready to face whatever came next. For a few days, the world seemed to pause. Reporters still lingered near the community center, but their questions had softened, replaced by curiosity rather than malice after Ethan's public statement. Some parents hesitated to drop off their children, worried about cameras, but most returned, trusting Leela, seeing Ethan helping with crafts or reading stories, his laughter echoing through the halls. Nana, always watching from her window across the street, would smile whenever she saw Ethan carrying boxes of snacks or kneeling to tie a child's shoe. It felt like hope, like the promise of something normal and warm. But peace is fragile, and the world rarely stays quiet for long. Late one evening, Leela was locking up the sender, the last light turning off as she zipped up her coat. Ethan was waiting for her outside, leaning against his Jeep with 2 cups of coffee, steam curling into the cold night air. "Walk you home?" he asked, smiling. She smiled back, accepting the warm cup. "Thank you." They began walking down the quiet Brooklyn street, passing shuttered shops and glowing streetlights. Their hands brushed, fingers interlocking easily comfortably. "I like this," Leela said softly. "Walking you home?" Ethan teased. She nudged him with her shoulder, laughing. "No, this. You, me. No suits, no press, just life." Ethan's smile softened, squeezing her hand gently. "Me too." They reached her building, pausing under the flickering streetlight. Leela turned to face him, her breath visible in the cold air. "Want to come up?" she asked, nerves fluttering. In her stomach, Ethan hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of the weight of what it meant. "I'd love to." Nana was watching her sitcom reruns when they entered, her eyes twinkling at the sight of Ethan. "Well, if it isn't our billionaire helper," she teased, waving from her recliner. Ethan laughed, leaning down to kiss her cheek. "Evening, Nana." Leela rolled her eyes, hiding her smile as she went to the kitchen to make tea. They sat on the small couch, knees brushing, cups warming their hands. They talked about nothing and everything, about Leela's dreams for the sender, about Ethan's favorite childhood memory of coding games on his mother's old computer, about Nana's stories of dancing in Harlem when she was young. The apartment felt warm, safe, like a world apart from the noise outside. As the clock neared midnight, Nana excused herself to bed, winking at Leela before shuffling down the hallway. Leela sat back down, her fingers twisting around her mug. "Ethan," she began, her voice soft but firm, "what happens now? When the cameras leave? When the next headline takes over? What happens to us?" Ethan set down his cup, turning to face her fully, taking her hands in his. "I don't want this to end when the cameras leave," he said, his eyes earnest. "I don't want you to be a moment in my life, Leela. I want you to be my life." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, her lips trembling into a small, hopeful smile. "Do you mean that?" she whispered. Ethan leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers, his eyes closing. "I've never meant anything more." She let out a shaky breath, her hands gripping his. "I'm scared." "I am too," he admitted, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes. "But I'd rather be scared with you than empty without you." She laughed, a soft, watery sound that made his chest tighten with affection. "Ethan Carter, the billionaire who's scared," she teased gently. "Only of losing you," he replied, his voice low, his thumb brushing across her cheek. They sat like that for a moment, the quiet of the apartment wrapping around them. Then slowly, Leela leaned in, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that was gentle at first, then deeper, filled with the promise of everything they were building together. When they pulled back, breathless, Leela rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Stay," she whispered. Ethan wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, his lips pressing to the top of her head. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised, and in that small, warm apartment in Brooklyn, under the glow of the streetlights outside, they let themselves believe in the quiet hope of love, of second chances, of building a life together one small moment at a time. The morning after Ethan stayed, the world outside continued its relentless pace, but inside Leela's small Brooklyn apartment, there was a quiet peace. Ethan woke before Leela, careful not to disturb her as he slipped from the couch to the small kitchen. Nana was already there, humming as she poured water into the kettle, her eyes twinkling as she saw him. Well, you make coffee too?" Nana teased. Ethan chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I try." "Good," she said, stirring her tea. "Because that girl deserves someone who tries." Ethan's smile faltered for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He nodded, taking a mug and pouring coffee for Leela the way she liked it, to sugars, a splash of milk. Leela woke to the scent of coffee and the soft murmur of voices in the kitchen. She stretched, her heart fluttering at the sight of Ethan in her small kitchen, laughing with Nana, looking so perfectly out of place, yet right at home. She paused in the doorway, taking in the moment, letting herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this was real. "Good morning," she finally said, stepping in. Ethan turned, his face lighting up. "Morning?" He handed her the coffee, their fingers brushing, a spark passing between them. She smiled softly, taking a sip. Perfect, she said, and he grinned, pride in his eyes. After breakfast, Ethan offered to walk Leela to the community center while Nana stayed back to rest. The walk was quiet, their fingers interlaced, the city around them, alive but distant. As they approached the center, they noticed a few reporters still lingering, though fewer than before. One lifted a camera, but Ethan shot him a warning look that made him lower it immediately. Inside, the children's laughter greeted them, washing away the tension of the outside world. While Leela organized morning activities, Ethan fixed a leaky faucet in the bathroom, replaced a broken shelf, and carried boxes of donated books from the storage to the reading nook. The children loved having him around. They followed him, giggling as he lifted them to hang their drawings higher on the wall, or when he made silly faces while reading aloud. Leela watched him from across the room, her heart swelling with something she hadn't let herself feel fully in a long time. Hope. Later that afternoon, Leela and Ethan sat together at a small table, helping Ella and a few other kids with coloring. Mr. Ethan, will you stay forever? Ella asked, her big brown eyes blinking up at him. Leela froze, her hand pausing on the crayon, her heart clenching. Ethan glanced at Leela, then back at Ella, a soft smile on his lips. I'll stay as long as you all will have me, Ella grinned, throwing her arms around his neck, making the other children giggle and join in. Leela laughed, tears pricking her eyes as she gently pulled the children back so Ethan could breathe. He looked at her, their eyes locking, both of them smiling, a silent promise passing between them. That evening, as they closed the center together, Leela leaned against the door, watching Ethan as he stacked the last of the chairs. Thank you, she said softly. For what? He asked, wiping his hands. For this, she gestured around, for not running when it got hard, for helping, for staying. Ethan stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. There's nowhere else I'd rather be. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his, and found only sincerity, warmth, and the quiet strength she had come to rely on. I'm scared of what's next, she whispered. I know, he replied, cupping her cheek, but we'll face it together. She nodded, leaning into his touch, closing her eyes as he kissed her forehead gently. That night, after Ethan walked her home and kissed her goodnight under the soft glow of the street lights, Leela lay awake, her hand pressed to her lips where his had been. The world was still uncertain, and her fears hadn't vanished, but for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that she didn't have to face it alone. Outside, the city continued its restless rhythm, but inside, in the quiet corners of her heart, Leela felt something growing, a fragile but fierce hope that maybe, just maybe, love was worth the risk. Days passed with a soft, steady rhythm. Ethan found himself slipping easily into Leela's world, helping Nana with groceries, carrying boxes for the community center, fixing broken hinges, and reading stories to the children as if he had always been there. The reporters eventually drifted away, tired of waiting for a scandal that never came, leaving behind whispers but no more flashing cameras. The city, relentless as always, moved on to the next headline. For the first time in years, Ethan felt peace. One Friday evening, Leela invited Ethan over for dinner. Nana made her famous chicken pot pie, humming in the kitchen as the scent of thyme and butter filled the small apartment. Ethan set the table, carefully placing mismatched plates and forks, while Leela prepared a small salad, stealing glances at him, warmth blooming in her chest. They ate together, laughter and stories weaving around them like a soft blanket. Nana told tales of her youth, making Ethan and Leela laugh so hard their stomachs hurt. For a while, they forgot the world outside. After dinner, Ethan helped with dishes while Leela dried them, their hands brushing, small sparks lighting up with each touch. I could get used to this, Ethan said softly, handing her a rinse plate. Leela looked up at him, a soft smile playing on her lips. Me too. Later that night, after Nana had gone to bed, they sat together on the couch, a movie playing quietly in the background, neither really watching. Leela's head rested on Ethan's shoulder, his arm around her, his thumb tracing soft circles on her arm. You've changed, you know, she whispered. Ethan tilted his head to look at her, raising an eyebrow. For better or worse, she laughed softly, her fingers brushing against his chest. For better, he kissed her temple, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. I don't know how I lived before this, he admitted, his voice low. Before you, she lifted her head, meeting his eyes, seeing the raw honesty there. You were surviving, she said softly. Now you're living. Just as Ethan was about to lean in to kiss her, his phone buzzed on the coffee table. He sighed, ignoring it, but it buzzed again and again, vibrating insistently. Leela pulled back slightly, nodding for him to answer. Ethan hesitated before picking up the phone. Yeah, he answered, his tone clipped. It was Derek, his voice tight and urgent. Ethan, you need to come in. Now. Ethan frowned. Derek, it's late. It can wait. No, it can't. There's been a breach. Ethan's stomach dropped. What kind of breach? A data breach, Ethan. Massive. Millions of accounts. We need you here. Ethan's world shifted, the warmth of the room fading as the reality of his other life crashed back in. He hung up, his hands shaking slightly. Ethan, Leela asked, her brows furrowed with concern. There's a problem at the company, he said, standing, running a hand through his hair. I need to go. Leela stood too, reaching for his hand. Is it serious? He looked at her, his eyes filled with worry. It could be. I don't know yet. Leela nodded, trying to hide the fear creeping into her chest. Go, do what you need to do. Ethan cupped her face, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I'll call you. Be safe, she whispered. Ethan left, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Leela standing in the quiet apartment, the warmth of the evening fading into the cold uncertainty of the night. She sank onto the couch, hugging a cushion to her chest, staring at the door, praying that the life they were building wouldn't crumble under the weight of the world Ethan was still tied to. Meanwhile, Ethan drove through the city, the lights blurring past as his mind raced. He had found something real with Leela, something worth protecting, something worth building. But his past, his choices, his company, everything he had built before her was crashing back in, threatening to rip away the peace he had found. And as he sped toward his office, Ethan Carter realized that to protect the future he wanted with Leela, he would have to face the ghosts of his past and the empire he had created. And no matter the cost, Ethan stepped into the glass fortress of his company's Manhattan headquarters just past midnight, the building humming with cold, sterile light. Security guards nodded stiffly as he passed, their eyes filled with the same fear he saw in every employee working late that night. Derek was waiting by the elevator, his face pale, his tie loosened. How bad is it? Ethan asked, his voice low, steady, though his stomach churned. Bad, Derek replied, falling into step beside him as they entered the executive floor. The breach is bigger than we thought. Millions of user accounts, financial data. It's all over the dark web already. Ethan's jaw tightened. Do we know who did it? We're working on tracing the source. Could be a rival, could be a hacktivist group, could be internal. Derek rubbed his eyes. The board is calling for an emergency meeting in 4 hours. They entered the war room, screens glowing with cascading lines of code, frantic engineers working, IT security leads on calls with government agencies. All eyes turned to Ethan, the room falling silent. Status? Ethan demanded, moving to the head of the table. A lead engineer cleared his throat. We've contained the breach, but the damage is done. Clients are panicking. Regulators are calling. Media will have it by morning. Ethan pressed his hands to the table, breathing deeply. Hours passed in a blur of conference calls, crisis plans, and back-to-back decisions. Ethan's mind worked like a machine, calculating, fixing, directing. But between the chaos, flashes of Leela's face kept appearing in his mind, her soft smile, the way she looked at him with trust, her laughter over dinner. This was the world he had fought to build, the world he was terrified would consume, the small, warm life he was trying to protect with her. As dawn broke, painting the glass windows in pale light, Derek placed a coffee in front of Ethan. You should call her, Derek said quietly. She's probably worried. Ethan rubbed his face, exhaustion sinking into his bones. I will. Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, Leela sat by the window, her phone in her lap, staring at it as if willing it to ring. Nana came in, holding 2 cups of tea. He'll call, honey. Leela tried to smile, but it was strained. I know. Men like him, they carry the world on their shoulders, Nana said, settling beside her. But sometimes they need someone to remind them they're allowed to let someone else in. Leela nodded, gripping her phone tighter. Hours later, as the sun climbed higher, Leela's phone finally buzzed. Ethan, she answered immediately, her voice soft. His voice was hoarse, tired. Hi, she swallowed, tears pricking her eyes at the sound of him. Are you okay? I will be, he said, leaning back in his office chair, staring at the city. It's bad, Leela. The breach. It's everything I've built at risk. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. Is there anything I can do? He was silent for a moment. Just don't leave. She opened her eyes, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. I'm not going anywhere. A shaky breath escaped him, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. Thank you. Whatever happens, Ethan, we'll figure it out, she whispered. After they hung up, Ethan stood, walking to the window, looking down at the city that he had once ruled with certainty, now filled with chaos and risk. But for the first time, he didn't feel alone facing it, and that somehow made him feel stronger. That evening, after endless meetings and a press statement, Ethan finally drove back to Brooklyn, exhaustion clouding his vision. When he reached Leela's building, she was waiting outside, wrapped in a soft sweater, her hair pulled back, her eyes warm despite the worry lining her face. She didn't say a word as he stepped out of the car. She simply walked up to him and wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly. And Ethan, the billionaire who had faced boardrooms, governments, and crises alone, allowed himself to break, burying his face in her shoulder, letting himself breathe. In that embrace, under the streetlight on a quiet Brooklyn street, Ethan Carter found a small, fierce reminder of why he was fighting so hard. And Leela, holding him close, realized that no matter how big the world's storms were, love could be a shelter in the middle of it all. The next morning, Leela woke to the sound of quiet movements in the kitchen. She found Ethan at the counter, making coffee, wearing one of the t-shirts Nana had lent him, looking so out of place, yet so perfectly right in her small Brooklyn apartment. Hey, she said softly, rubbing her eyes. He turned, a tired but genuine smile spreading across his face. Hey, she stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him from behind, resting her cheek against his back. How are you holding up? He sighed, placing a hand over hers. I've been better. She pulled back, tilting her head to look at him. But you're here. I'm here, he echoed, turning to face her fully, brushing a strand of hair from her face. And I'm not running. They sat together at the small table, drinking coffee as the early light filtered through the thin curtains. Ethan explained what had happened, the breach, the fear of clients pulling out, the risk of investors demanding his resignation, the possibility of lawsuits. He finished. Ethan looked at her, his eyes tired but clear. I couldn't have done it without you. Leela's eyes softened, tears welling. I'm glad you let me in. He cupped her face, brushing away a tear with his thumb. You're my anchor, Leela. They sat in silence for a while, sipping tea, letting the soft hum of the city outside fill the space between them. I want to take you somewhere tomorrow, Ethan said suddenly. Leela raised an eyebrow. Where? You'll see, he replied, a small, mischievous smile playing on his lips. The next morning, Ethan arrived early with breakfast, fresh bagels, fruit, and coffee from Leela's favorite corner cafe. Someone's in a good mood, Leela teased, accepting the coffee gratefully. Ethan just grinned, his eyes dancing. Get dressed. Comfortable shoes. They drove out of the city, leaving the towering buildings behind, crossing bridges and rolling past quiet suburbs until the scenery turned into soft green hills and trees swaying in the breeze. Leela looked out the window, curiosity sparkling in her eyes. Are you going to tell me where we're going now? Almost there, Ethan replied, glancing at her with a soft smile. Finally, they pulled into a gravel driveway leading to a small lake, the water shimmering under the morning sun, surrounded by weeping willows and wildflowers. Leela stepped out, her eyes widening as she took in the peaceful scene. Ethan, this is beautiful. It's my mother's, Ethan said softly, stepping beside her. She brought me here every summer as a kid. I haven't been back in years. Leela turned to him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes. I wanted to share it with you, he continued, his voice low, because it's the one place that always felt like home. They walked along the lakeside, hand in hand, the soft breeze carrying the scent of water and grass. Ethan stopped under a willow, turning to face her. I don't know what the future holds, Leela, he said, his eyes searching hers. But I know I want you in it. Leela's breath caught, tears welling as she smiled. I want that too, she whispered. Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, simple silver key. This is the key to the lake house, he said, softly, placing it in her hand. It's yours too now, a place for us whenever we need to breathe. Leela stared at the key, her heart swelling, tears spilling down her cheeks. I love you, Ethan, she whispered, looking up at him, her eyes shining. I love you too, Leela, he replied, pulling her into his arms. They stood there, under the willow by the quiet lake, the world around them fading, wrapped in the certainty of a love that was no longer fragile, but rooted, steady, and true. The next morning at the lake house, soft golden light poured through the windows, illuminating the cozy wooden walls. Leela woke to the sound of birds chirping and the gentle rustle of trees swaying in the breeze. For a moment, she simply lay there, letting the peace seep into her bones, her hand resting on the pillow where Ethan had been. She found him outside, sitting on the dock, feet dangling over the water, a mug of coffee in his hands. He turned when he heard her, a warm smile spreading across his face. Morning, he said softly. Morning, she replied, wrapping her arms around herself as she sat beside him. They sat in silence, watching the light dance on the water. I used to sit here with my mom, Ethan said after a while, his voice distant but calm. She would read while I fished, even though I was terrible at it. We didn't have much, but this place was our world. Leela rested her head on his shoulder, listening. When she died, I promised myself I would take care of everything, that I would become someone who could never be powerless again, Ethan continued, his eyes on the water. I thought money would protect me, that it would keep me from ever losing something I loved. He let out a breath, turning to her. But then I met you, and I realized, none of it matters if I don't have something real to fight for. Leela's eyes filled with tears as she cupped his face. You're not alone anymore, Ethan. He closed his eyes, pressing his forehead to hers, letting himself breathe. They spent the day at the lake, walking barefoot along the shore, cooking breakfast together in the small kitchen, and laughing. As Ethan attempted to teach Leela how to skip stones, you're cheating, Leela accused as Ethan's stone skipped perfectly across the water. It's physics, Ethan teased, his eyes crinkling with laughter. Oh, Mr. Billionaire knows physics, does he? Leela teased back, splashing water at him. Ethan laughed, stepping forward and wrapping his arms around her waist, lifting her slightly as she squealed, water splashing around them. Their laughter echoed across the quiet lake, filling the air with warmth. That evening, they built a small fire in the pit near the dock, roasting marshmallows as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. Tell me a dream, Leela said, leaning against him as they watched the fire crackle. Ethan was quiet for a moment, then said softly, I dream of waking up with you every morning, of building something that matters, not just for me, but for others, of having a family, a home that feels like this. Leela turned to look at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. That's a beautiful dream. He smiled, brushing a thumb across her cheek. What about you? She hesitated, then whispered, I dream of loving without fear, of creating a home where laughter is louder than worry, of having someone who chooses me every day. Ethan leaned in, kissing her softly, the firelight dancing around them as the stars began to appear above. I choose you, he whispered against her lips. They sat in the quiet, watching the stars, wrapped in a blanket, their fingers intertwined. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt safe, and for the first time in a long time, Leela felt chosen. They returned to the city 2 days later, the lake's quiet peace still lingering in their hearts as they stepped back into the hum of Brooklyn's streets. Ethan walked Leela up to the community center, pausing at the door. You don't have to come in, Leela said softly, sensing the weight of the world pulling at him again. He shook his head. I want to. Inside, the kids ran up to Leela, hugging her legs, their laughter ringing through the hall. Ethan watched her kneel, ruffling their hair, her face glowing as she listened to them excitedly talk about their drawings and games. Mr. Ethan, a little boy called, tugging at Ethan's sleeve. Ethan crouched down, smiling. Yeah, buddy, can you help us with the blocks today? The boy asked, eyes hopeful. Ethan glanced at Leela, who nodded with a smile, before turning back to the boy. Of course. For the next hour, Ethan found himself surrounded by small hands, bright laughter, and the chaos of building towers that toppled over with squeals of delight. Leela stood by the door, watching him, her heart swelling as she saw Ethan's face soften, the hard lines of stress replaced by gentle smiles and quiet laughter. After the session, they sat together in Leela's small office, sipping tea. I wish I could freeze moments like this, Ethan said quietly, staring at his cup. Leela reached over, placing her hand over his. You can't freeze them, Ethan, but you can live them. He looked up at her, his eyes searching. Do you think this, us, is real enough to last? Leela's heart clenched. I do, but it will take choosing each other, every day, even when it's hard. Ethan squeezed her hand, nodding. I'm willing. That evening, Ethan returned to his penthouse, stepping into the stark contrast of glass, marble, and cold silence. The moment the door closed behind him, the loneliness rushed back, heavy and cold. He stood there for a moment before walking to the window, staring out at the city lights. His phone buzzed. Derek, call me. It's urgent. Ethan's stomach dropped. As he dialed immediately, talk to me, Ethan said, pacing. Derek's voice was tight. The cybersecurity firm found evidence that the breach was an inside job. Ethan froze. What? Someone inside your company sold access to your systems, Ethan, Derek continued. And that's not all. The media caught wind of it. They're spinning it as your negligence. Ethan pressed a hand to his forehead, anger and fear rising. Who? We don't know yet, but there's more. Derek paused. Ethan, your personal accounts were accessed to. Ethan's blood ran cold. My accounts, emails, private files. And Ethan, your anonymous donations to the center, someone leaked them. Ethan's vision blurred for a moment. No, the next morning, the headlines exploded. Billionaire's hidden life exposed. Ethan Carter's secret ties to Brooklyn Center revealed. Ethan Carter under fire again. Internal sabotage and scandal. Leela's phone buzzed as she prepared breakfast, her eyes scanning the headline, her hands trembling. She read the article, her heart sinking as it described Ethan's donations, twisting them into a narrative of manipulation, suggesting he was using the center for tax evasion or publicity. A knock came at the door. It was Nana, holding her phone with the same headline on the screen, her eyes wide. The same moment, Ethan stood in his office, watching his employees whisper as the news spread, his phone ringing nonstop with reporters demanding statements. He picked up his phone, dialing Leela. She answered on the first ring, her voice shaking. Ethan, I'm so sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I didn't want this to touch you. Tell me it isn't true, she whispered. It's not, Ethan said fiercely. The donations were real. For you? For the kids, for Nana. It was never for show. Leela's breath shook. The center is under investigation, Ethan. They're freezing accounts until they verify everything. Ethan's heart dropped. Leela, I will fix this. After they hung up, Ethan stood by the window, fists clenched, the city a blur beneath him. This wasn't just about the company anymore. They were attacking the only place that felt like home. They were attacking her. Ethan turned, his eyes cold with determination. Derek, he called, stepping out of his office. Get me everything we have on the breach and the leak. Derek nodded, seeing the fire in Ethan's eyes. And get the jet ready, Ethan added. I'm going to fix this. The private jet cut through the dawn sky as Ethan leaned back in his seat, laptop open, documents scattered, and Derek on the other end of a call, updating him with every new detail of the sabotage they had traced. The breach back to an executive Ethan had once mentored, a man who had felt overshadowed and used the company's crisis to line his own pockets and strike at Ethan's image. We have the evidence, Ethan, Derek said. It's enough to clear you and the company. Ethan closed his eyes, a wave of relief washing over him, but it was short-lived. It's not just about me, Ethan said, gripping the armrest. We need to clear Leela's center too, ours. Later, Ethan arrived in Brooklyn, stepping out of the car as cameras flashed. Reporters shouted his name, demanding comments, but he ignored them, pushing through until he reached the community center. Inside, the air was heavy with tension. Leela stood near the window, arms crossed, staring at the street outside. Nana sat, quietly, clutching her rosary, the children sent home until the center's accounts could be unfrozen. Leela turned as Ethan entered, her eyes red but clear. Ethan. Leela. They stared at each other, the chaos of the world outside silencing as they stood in the quiet room. I'm so sorry, Ethan began, stepping closer. I never wanted this to touch you, or the kids or Nana. Leela's eyes filled with tears as she stepped forward, placing a hand on his chest. I know, I never doubted you. Relief and emotion overwhelmed him, and he pulled her into a tight embrace, burying his face in her hair. Together, they sat with Nana as Ethan explained everything, the betrayal, the sabotage, the plan to clear the sender's name and unfreeze its accounts. Will they listen? Leela asked, her voice shaking. They will, Ethan said firmly. Because I won't give them a choice. Ethan called a press conference outside the center, stepping in front of the cameras, Leela and Nana watching from the window. Today, I'm here to set the record straight, Ethan began, his voice strong. The breach at my company was an act of internal sabotage, and we have the evidence. It will be turned over to authorities immediately. Reporters shouted questions, but Ethan raised his hand. As for the community center behind me, every dollar I gave was out of gratitude and commitment to a place that changes lives. These donations were never about image. They were about giving back to a community that became my home. His eyes lifted to the window where Leela stood, meeting her gaze. And I will continue to support them, openly and fully, because what they do here matters. The crowd fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Within days, the truth spread. The executive responsible was arrested, the breach fully traced, and the center's accounts were cleared. Leela returned to the center, children flooding in with laughter and noise, the warmth returning to the hallways. That evening, as the sun set, Ethan arrived at the center with pizza in hand. The children squealed in delight, Nana clapped her hands, and Leela simply stood there, watching him, tears in her eyes. Hero, she whispered, as he set the boxes down. No, Ethan said, stepping closer, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Just a man in love. Leela's eyes sparkled, her lips curving into a radiant smile. I love you. Ethan leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. I love you too. Later, they sat on the steps outside the center, the city humming softly around them. You could live anywhere, Leela said quietly, looking up at him. You could run away from all of this. Ethan shook his head, pulling her closer. I don't want to run anymore. I want this. You, the center, Brooklyn, the kids, Nana. This is home. She looked up, her eyes filled with emotion. Home, he smiled, kissing her softly under the streetlight. The camera pans up from their embrace, capturing the quiet Brooklyn street, the laughter of children echoing faintly, the lights of the city glowing around them. Ethan Carter, the billionaire who once felt alone in a glass tower, had found the one thing money could never buy, a place to belong, and a love worth fighting for.